She went for an abortion at 6 weeks, but discovered she was carrying the vampire king's triplets. The ultrasound screen flickered with 3 heartbeats that pulsed in perfect synchrony. What the clinic didn't know was that vampire offspring could only survive in a human womb once every century, and their father would burn down every hospital to protect them. Mara's fingers traced the edges of the intake form, black ink bleeding slightly where her sweaty palms had pressed too hard against the paper. The waiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench beyond the usual morning sickness. She'd been here before, 3 years ago when the pregnancy scare with Marcus turned out to be nothing, but this time felt different. This time the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, casting harsh shadows that moved when she wasn't looking directly at them. The other women in the waiting room sat in careful silence, each wrapped in their own bubble of decision and consequence. But Mara felt exposed, as if invisible eyes tracked her every movement. She checked the appointment time again, though she'd memorized it hours ago. Dr. Elena Vasquez, 2:30 p.m., consultation and procedure. The words blurred as she read them, her vision swimming with exhaustion she couldn't explain. 6 weeks pregnant from a night she could barely piece together, fragments of memory surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. The gallery opening for Marcus's friend, champagne that tasted too sweet, and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow light. She remembered dancing, the press of a stranger's hand against the small of her back, the way he whispered her name like he'd known her for centuries. Everything after remained locked behind a fog that felt almost deliberate, as if her mind refused to process what had happened. The receptionist called her name, and Mara's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the nurse down a corridor lined with motivational posters about women's health and reproductive choice. The ultrasound room was smaller than she expected, dominated by the machine that would show her what grew inside her body. The technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and steady hands, helped Mara onto the examination table and began the familiar routine of gel and pressure and searching. But when the wand found what it was looking for, the woman's expression shifted from professional calm to confusion, then to something approaching alarm. 3 distinct heartbeats filled the room, not the fluttering birdwing rhythm Mara expected, but something deeper, more resonant, beating in perfect synchrony like a drum circle in her womb. The technician adjusted the machine, checked the settings, and tried again, but the result remained unchanged. 3 heartbeats, impossibly strong for 6 weeks, each one distinct yet harmonizing with the others in a pattern that seemed almost musical. The room grew cold, the air conditioning kicking in with a sudden whoosh that made Mara shiver despite the warm gel on her skin. Outside, clouds gathered with unnatural speed, blotting out the afternoon sun that had been shining minutes before, casting the room into premature twilight. The technician's hands trembled as she called for Dr. Vasquez, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mara felt something shift inside her chest, a pulling sensation like invisible threads drawing taut, connecting her to something vast and ancient that stirred at the edge of awareness. The ultrasound machine began to flicker, static lines racing across the screen, and then with a sudden crack of ozone and sparks, it died completely, leaving them in darkness broken only by the emergency lighting that kicked in with harsh red efficiency. Dr. Vasquez arrived within minutes, her presence immediately changing the energy in the room from panic to controlled urgency. She was younger than Mara had expected, maybe 40, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She ordered additional tests, blood work that would normally take days to process, but somehow came back within an hour. Results that made the doctor's face go pale as she studied the printouts. Hormone levels that defied medical explanation, cellular activity that suggested rapid development, and genetic markers that didn't match anything in the standard databases. Throughout the building, security cameras began to malfunction one by one, their feeds cutting to static or going black entirely, as if some invisible force moved through the corridors, disabling technology with each step. Mara felt increasingly disconnected from her body, watching herself answer questions about her medical history and the circumstances of conception, while part of her mind drifted towards something that called from the shadows. When Dr. Vasquez suggested she remain for observation, Mara agreed despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The clinic felt wrong, charged with electricity that made her skin crawl and her teeth ache. She tried to call Marcus from the recovery room, but her phone was dead, the screen black and unresponsive despite showing a full charge that morning. The landline in the room produced only static, and when she asked to use the desk phone at the nurse's station, it too had mysteriously failed. By evening, when Dr. Vasquez finally cleared her to leave, the entire building felt like the epicenter of some invisible storm. Mara gathered her things and headed for the parking garage, her footsteps echoing in the artificial silence that had settled over everything. Her car, a reliable Honda that had never given her trouble, refused to start. The engine didn't even turn over, as if all the electronics had simply died. She sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, fighting the urge to scream or cry or both, when she felt someone watching her. The presence was unmistakable, a weight in the air that made her skin prickle with awareness. She turned, and he stepped from the shadows between two concrete pillars, moving with fluid grace that seemed to bend light around his form. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly, sharp cheekbones and pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, dark hair that absorbed the fluorescent glare from the overhead fixtures. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, dark as the space between stars, ancient in a way that spoke of centuries rather than decades. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but moved like someone comfortable with violence despite the civilized appearance. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent she couldn't place, something European and old, refined by centuries of use. He approached her car with slow, deliberate steps, and she found herself unable to move, trapped not by fear, but by a recognition that went deeper than memory. He knocked gently on her window, and when she lowered it with hands that shook despite her efforts to stay calm, he smiled with genuine remorse rather than predatory satisfaction. Without asking permission, he opened her door and knelt beside her, one hand reaching toward her abdomen with reverent care. She should have screamed, should have fought, should have done anything other than let this stranger touch her. But when his palm pressed against her still flat stomach, warmth flooded through her body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The babies, and she knew with sudden certainty that's what they were, responded to his presence with movement that felt almost like recognition. His touch awakened something in her blood, a connection that felt older than civilization, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. He told her his name, Kieran Thorne, and explained what she carried with a gentleness that somehow made the impossible facts easier to accept. 3 children, the first vampire heirs born in over a century, conceived not through accident, but through ancient magic that had chosen her bloodline for reasons stretching back generations. They were children of prophecy, he said, beings who would either unite the fractured vampire world or destroy it entirely, and their existence had already set forces in motion that could not be stopped. The vampire king knelt before her in a concrete parking garage, his hand still pressed against her womb, and asked not for forgiveness for what he had done, but for the chance to protect what they had created together. Around them, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer to a question that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. Kieran's estate rose from the Seattle hills, like something torn from a Gothic novel and transplanted into the modern world, its black stone towers and arched windows disguised behind carefully maintained hedges and a gate that looked ordinary until Mara noticed the subtle shimmer in the air around it, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, but colder, more deliberate. The mansion itself sprawled across manicured grounds that seemed too large for the property lines she could see, as if space itself bent around the building to accommodate rooms and corridors that shouldn't fit. Gothic spires pierced the evening sky, while the ground floor windows showed warm yellow light that looked almost normal until she realized no shadows moved behind them, despite the people she could sense inside. Kieran led her through the front entrance, past doors carved with symbols that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them, into a foyer dominated by a chandelier that cast light without seeming to have any visible bulbs. The interior balanced medieval grandeur with modern comfort, tapestries depicting battles between creatures she hoped were mythical hanging beside flat-screen monitors that showed security feeds from around the property. Servants moved through the halls with supernatural quiet, men and women whose pale skin and too graceful movements marked them as something other than human, their eyes tracking to her with barely concealed curiosity before Kieran's presence sent them scurrying away. He guided her to a library that could have housed a university's collection, shelves stretching up 3 stories to a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Sebastian waited there, tall and angular with silver hair that contrasted sharply with his apparent youth, his presence carrying an authority that felt almost military in its precision. When Kieran introduced him as his lieutenant and oldest friend, Sebastian's bow held just enough irony to suggest centuries of familiarity with protocol he found tedious. The conversation that followed shattered every assumption Mara had about pregnancy, biology, and the nature of life itself. Vampire reproduction, Sebastian explained with clinical detachment, occurred perhaps once in a century when cosmic alignments and blood magic converged to create the possibility of offspring. But these children hadn't been conceived through chance encounter or casual feeding. They had chosen her specifically because her bloodline carried traces of an ancient pact made between her ancestor and the vampire courts during the Salem witch trials. Her great-great-grandmother had been a healer who'd saved a vampire's life and been granted protection for her descendants in exchange, a debt written in blood and magic that had passed through generations until it called to these children seeking a womb capable of sustaining their development. The pregnancy would last only 4 months, but during that time, her body would undergo changes that would leave her forever altered, neither fully human nor vampire, but something entirely new. Her medical training rebelled against the impossibility of what she was hearing, demanding explanations that made scientific sense. But when Kieran placed his hand over hers, she felt the truth of it humming in her bones, like electricity through copper wire. Sebastian's expression grew grimmer as he explained the political implications, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. The vampire world had been fractured for centuries, split between 3 major clans that ruled different territories, with an uneasy balance maintained through blood oaths and careful negotiation. The Shadowmere controlled the eastern seaboard with iron discipline and ancient traditions. The Crimson Court held power in the south through networks of wealth and influence, while the Northern Covenant maintained their grip on the western territories through alliances with other supernatural beings. Each clan claimed descent from the original vampire lords, and each believed they alone possessed the right to rule over all vampires when the prophesied time came. These triplets, according to texts older than written history, would either unite the clans under a new kind of leadership or destroy the careful balance entirely, plunging their hidden world into war that would spill over into the human realm with catastrophic consequences. The children growing in her womb weren't just babies. They were living weapons whose very existence had already set ancient wheels in motion, drawing attention from powers that had slumbered for decades. Within days of arriving at the estate, Mara's body began changing in ways that defied everything she'd learned in medical school, transformations that started subtly but accelerated with each passing hour until she felt like a stranger in her own skin. Her senses sharpened first, sounds becoming so clear she could hear conversations 3 floors below. Scents growing so vivid she could track individual people through the mansion by their unique signatures of soap and skin and something deeper, something that pulsed with life. Colors became more saturated, the world taking on an almost painful brilliance that forced her to wear sunglasses even indoors until her eyes adjusted to processing light spectrums she'd never perceived before. Her strength increased gradually, little things like opening jars that had been difficult becoming effortless, then larger changes like accidentally crushing a coffee mug when she gripped it too tightly, the ceramic crumbling in her fingers like sand. But the most unsettling change was emotional, a growing awareness of the three distinct personalities developing inside her, each one already showing traces of temperament and preference that felt more like roommates than developing fetuses. One of them, the one she began thinking of as the calm one, radiated peace and seemed to respond to music by moving in gentle waves that felt almost like dancing. Another pulsed with curiosity and energy, always active, always exploring the boundaries of her womb, with tiny hands and feet that kicked against her ribs with increasing strength. The third remained more mysterious, quieter, but somehow older, its presence carrying weight that felt almost like wisdom despite its impossible youth. During her first formal dinner with Kieran's inner circle, seated at a table that could have hosted a medieval feast while servers brought courses she couldn't identify, Mara experienced what Kieran later called her first blood call. It started as a subtle awareness of the pulse points of everyone in the room, the rhythm of hearts beating in chests around her becoming almost hypnotically fascinating. But the fascination quickly became hunger, a gnawing need that started in her stomach and spread through her body like fire. Focusing on the young servant who was refilling water glasses with hands that trembled slightly under her increasingly predatory gaze. The urge to attack came without warning, a surge of primal instinct that had her halfway out of her chair before Kieran's hand closed around her wrist with gentle but immovable pressure, his voice cutting through the bloodlust with quiet authority as he guided her back to her seat and signaled for the servants to withdraw. The hunger faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her shaking and horrified while the other vampires at the table pretended nothing had happened, continuing their conversation about territorial disputes and blood bank regulations as if she hadn't just nearly assaulted an innocent person. Later, alone with Kieran in his private study, while rain drummed against windows that showed a view of the city lights spread below like scattered diamonds, he explained the blood call with the patient tone of someone who'd guided others through similar transitions. The children were vampire, and as they grew stronger, they would need more than what her human blood could provide, so her body was adapting to become capable of feeding them properly, developing predatory instincts that would ensure their survival even at the cost of her humanity. But the hunger could be controlled, channeled, satisfied through other means that wouldn't require her to harm innocents, and he would teach her those techniques as her pregnancy progressed. His own story emerged gradually during these late-night conversations, 3 centuries of existence that began with loss and continued through duty rather than desire. His first mate had died in the plague that swept through London in the 1600s, taking with her any hope he'd had for children or happiness, leaving him to rule the vampire courts through obligation rather than ambition. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care for someone's well-being more than their political usefulness. But these children and their mother were awakening emotions he'd thought permanently buried under centuries of calculated governance. The triplets seemed to sense the growing connection between their parents, responding with increased movement whenever Kieran was near, as if they recognized his presence and approved of the bond forming between the adults who would guide their early years. But even as the estate felt more like home, and her relationship with Kieran deepened into something that resembled genuine partnership, security footage from the exterior cameras showed figures watching from the tree line at the edge of the property, shadowy forms that disappeared when guards investigated but returned night after night with increasing boldness. Sebastian's sources confirmed what they all suspected. The triumvirate, the 3 most powerful elder vampires from the opposing clans, had learned of the pregnancy and were planning their response to what they saw as an existential threat to their power structure. The mansion that had felt like sanctuary was becoming a fortress under siege, and the children growing stronger in her womb were the prize that multiple factions would kill to possess. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The triumvirate arrived at midnight under the ancient laws of parley, their presence announced not by the estate's security system, but by the way every flower in the gardens withered simultaneously, petals falling like black snow in the moonlight, while the very air grew thick with the weight of accumulated centuries. Lysander came first, stepping from a shadow that seemed deeper than the others, his appearance so perfectly aristocratic that he looked like a marble statue given life, pale skin unmarked by time, and eyes the color of winter storms that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Behind him followed Morgana, beautiful in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, her red hair cascading over shoulders draped in silk that shifted colors in the lamplight, while her smile promised both pleasure and pain in equal measure. Valdres materialized last, a mountain of a man whose presence seemed to bend gravity around him, scars marking his hands and face like a roadmap of violence that stretched back to battles fought before the invention of gunpowder, his voice carrying the weight of avalanches when he spoke. They moved through the estate with the confidence of beings who'd never encountered anything they couldn't kill or control, servants scattering before them like leaves before a hurricane, while the very foundations of the mansion groaned under the pressure of their combined power. Kieran met them in the formal reception hall, dressed in clothing that matched their antiquated formality, Sebastian at his right shoulder while other members of his inner circle formed a careful semicircle behind them, everyone understanding that this meeting would determine whether the next few weeks passed in uneasy peace or open warfare. Mara watched from the gallery above, her hands pressed against the ornate railing while the babies inside her responded to the tension with increasing agitation, their movements growing sharp and urgent as if they could sense the threat these ancient beings represented to their continued existence. The conversation that followed unfolded according to protocols older than written language, ritual phrases and ceremonial gestures that carried meanings lost to all but those who'd lived through centuries of vampire politics. But beneath the civilized veneer lay threats that made the air itself vibrate with potential violence. Lysander spoke for the triumvirate, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, demanding that Kieran surrender the unborn children to their collective custody for the good of vampire society as a whole. The prophecy, he claimed, spoke not of 3 children but of one ultimate ruler who would emerge from among them, and that ruler must be raised by the combined wisdom of the elder clans, rather than corrupted by Kieran's attachment to human concerns. They saw his relationship with Mara as weakness, evidence that he'd been compromised by emotions that had no place in vampire leadership, and they questioned whether someone who could form such attachments possessed the ruthlessness necessary to guide their people through the challenges that lay ahead. Morgana's contribution came wrapped in honeyed words that barely concealed the venom beneath, suggesting that Mara herself represented a security risk whose continued presence endangered not only the children, but the secrecy that protected vampire society from human discovery. Valdres remained silent throughout most of the exchange, but when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of military authority, outlining the forces at his command and the consequences of resistance with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who'd orchestrated countless conflicts throughout history. The ultimatum came with theatrical precision: 7 days for Kieran to make his decision, 7 days before they would return to claim what they considered rightfully theirs, regardless of his cooperation. As they prepared to leave, the temperature in the hall dropped 20 degrees, frost forming on the windows despite the warmth of the late spring evening, their departure as dramatic as their arrival, and infinitely more ominous in its implications. That night, Unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion, Mara wandered the corridors of the mansion like a ghost, her heightened senses picking up fragments of whispered conversations and the subtle sounds of preparations for a siege that everyone hoped wouldn't come. It was past 3 in the morning when she heard Sebastian's voice carrying from his private office, the tone urgent and secretive in a way that made her pause outside his door, her enhanced hearing allowing her to catch fragments of a phone conversation that chilled her blood more thoroughly than the triumvirate's threats had managed. He was reporting to someone, providing details about the mansion's defenses and the estimated timeline for the children's birth, information that could only be valuable to enemies planning an attack. His words carefully chosen to avoid specific names while still conveying intelligence that could get them all killed. The realization that Kieran's most trusted lieutenant might be betraying them sent waves of panic through her system, triggering a response from the babies that felt like protective rage channeled through her nervous system, power she didn't understand, flowing through her body with the force of a lightning strike. Every piece of glass in her bedroom exploded simultaneously, windows and mirrors and drinking glasses shattering with crystalline screams that brought guards running while she stood in the center of the destruction, cuts bleeding on her arms and face, but the babies safe within her womb, their presence pulsing with satisfaction, as if they'd successfully defended against a threat only they could perceive. Marcus appeared at the estate's gates 3 days later, during the bright afternoon hours, when most of the vampires retreated to their private chambers to escape the sun's burning touch. His familiar presence both comforting and terrifying, as Mara realized how much her old life felt like a costume she'd outgrown. He looked exactly as she remembered, sandy brown hair perpetually messed from running his fingers through it when he was thinking, green eyes that had always seen too much despite his carefully cultivated image as the easygoing photographer who never took anything too seriously, wearing clothes that managed to look expensive despite being purchased at discount stores. The same combination of confidence and vulnerability that had attracted her in college and driven her away when his need for stability clashed with her determination to build a medical career that wouldn't depend on anyone else's support. The guards tried to turn him away, but his press credentials and carefully crafted story about photographing architectural details for a magazine article got him past the outer perimeter before anyone realized he was specifically looking for her, his persistence and charm working their familiar magic, even on supernatural beings who should have known better than to trust human manipulation. When Mara met him in the rose garden, choosing neutral ground where they could talk without Kieran's immediate presence, she felt the weight of the choices she'd made settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket, the comfortable familiarity of his presence warring with the knowledge that he represented everything she was leaving behind. His concern was genuine, worry lines creasing his forehead as he catalogued the changes in her appearance the way her pregnancy showed differently than it should have at barely 2 months, the subtle alterations in her posture and movement that spoke of strength and awareness that hadn't been there before. He'd tracked her through hospital records and credit card transactions, following a trail that should have been impossible to piece together, if not for his investigative skills and the desperation that came from genuinely caring about her well-being, his questions probing gently at first, then with increasing urgency as her evasive answers failed to satisfy his growing suspicions. The conversation became increasingly strained as she tried to explain her situation without revealing the supernatural elements that would sound like delusions to someone unprepared for such revelations, her half-truths and careful omissions only convincing him that she was in some kind of trouble that required rescue, rather than the complex reality of choices that had reshaped her entire understanding of herself and her place in the world. When he offered to help raise the children as his own, promising to provide the stability and normal life she'd always claimed to want, she felt something break inside her chest, the life she'd planned crumbling in the face of a reality that had become both more dangerous and more meaningful than anything she'd imagined possible. His proposal forced her to choose not just between two men, but between two entirely different versions of herself, the cautious pre-med student who'd dated Marcus for 3 years because he represented safety and predictability, or the woman she was becoming under Kieran's influence. Someone capable of supernatural feats and responsibilities that stretched far beyond personal happiness. The confrontation reached its peak when Marcus, frustrated by her continued resistance to what he saw as an obvious solution, tried to physically guide her toward his car, his hand closing around her wrist with the assumption of authority that had always bothered her during their relationship, the presumption that he knew what was best for her better than she knew herself. Kieran's arrival happened with supernatural swiftness, one moment absent, and the next standing behind Marcus, with the kind of stillness that predators adopt just before they strike, his hand fastening around the human man's throat with pressure that lifted him off his feet, while his eyes blazed with fury that had very little to do with territorial instincts and everything to do with genuine protective rage. The violence would have been swift and final if Mara hadn't stepped between them, her voice cutting through Kieran's anger with an authority that surprised all three of them. The babies inside her responding to the conflict with agitation that sent power coursing through her system, enough to make both men step back and reassess the situation. Marcus left with promises that felt more like threats, 48 hours to contact him with a reasonable explanation, or he would go to the authorities with everything he'd observed, his final words delivered with the kind of hurt anger that comes from losing something precious to forces beyond understanding. The incident revealed the darker implications of Kieran's protection, the way his devotion could become possessive, his willingness to kill for her safety, transforming the mansion from sanctuary into a beautiful prison where her choices were limited by his determination to keep her safe, regardless of the cost to her autonomy. Dr. Vasquez arrived at the estate just after dawn, her medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, while her usually composed demeanor showed cracks that spoke of sleepless nights and discoveries that had shaken her understanding of reality to its foundations. She carried with her a leather satchel that seemed too heavy for its size, filled with documents stolen from archives that officially didn't exist. Research conducted by organizations that operated in the shadows between government agencies and academic institutions, studying phenomena that mainstream science refused to acknowledge. The security footage from her clinic had led her down a rabbit hole of classified research and supernatural medicine, connections between unexplained pregnancies and cosmic events that stretched back centuries. Patterns that suggested her encounter with Mara was neither coincidence nor isolated incident, but part of something vast and orchestrated by forces that viewed human lives as chess pieces in a game too complex for mortal comprehension. When Kieran granted her emergency sanctuary, recognizing the courage it took for a human to voluntarily enter vampire territory with knowledge that could get her killed by multiple factions, she spread her findings across the library table with the methodical precision of someone presenting evidence that would reshape everything they thought they understood about the prophecy and its implications. The complete text, pieced together from fragments scattered across multiple languages and cultures, told a story that was both more hopeful and more terrifying than any of them had imagined. Speaking not of vampire supremacy, but of bridge builders who would herald a new age of supernatural integration with humanity. The triplets weren't destined to rule the vampire world but to transform it, their birth triggering an awakening that would reveal the supernatural realm to human society and force both species to choose between cooperation and mutual destruction. According to the ancient seers who'd first recorded the prophecy, the children would possess abilities that transcended traditional vampire powers, capable of communicating telepathically with humans, healing supernatural and mortal injuries alike, and most importantly, inspiring others to overcome the fear and prejudice that had kept the two worlds separate for millennia. But this integration would come at a cost that made the current political tensions seem trivial. By comparison, because the revelation of vampire existence would shatter human society's understanding of reality, while simultaneously exposing supernatural communities to technological warfare, they weren't equipped to survive. The children could only fulfill their destiny if their mother chose to carry them to term with full knowledge of what that choice would unleash, because the magic that sustained them required willing sacrifice rather than ignorant cooperation. The difference between consent and coercion, determining whether their birth brought peace or apocalypse. Mara felt the weight of this revelation settling into her bones like lead. The realization that she wasn't just carrying three babies, but holding the future of two species in her womb. Every decision she made rippling outward through possibilities that included both utopian integration and species-wide extinction. The children responded to her emotional turmoil with movement that felt almost like reassurance, their presence pulsing with an awareness that seemed far too advanced for their developmental stage, as if they understood the magnitude of their destiny and were trying to comfort the woman whose body would either birth them into a world ready for change or deny them existence entirely. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed additional complications that made the political maneuvering of the vampire clans seem like kindergarten disputes, because other supernatural species had their own prophecies and agendas, werewolf packs that saw the vampire children as a threat to their territorial agreements, witches whose covens had foreseen this moment and prepared spells that could either protect or destroy the emerging hybrid reality, and fake courts that viewed any change to the supernatural status quo as an opportunity to reclaim power they'd lost centuries ago. But the most devastating revelation came when Dr. Vasquez produced recordings she'd made of encrypted communications she'd intercepted while researching Mara's case. Sebastian's voice clearly audible as he provided detailed intelligence to contacts he referred to only by code names. His reports painting the pregnancy not as a miraculous bridge between worlds, but as a biological weapon that threatened to destabilize civilization itself. The betrayal hit Kieran with the force of a physical blow, 3 centuries of trust and friendship crumbling as he realized his most loyal lieutenant had been systematically undermining their security while preparing the way for what Sebastian believed would be a necessary intervention to prevent supernatural apocalypse. The recordings revealed the depth of Sebastian's conviction that the children represented an existential threat that justified any means necessary to stop their birth. His contacts including not just vampire hunters, but government agents and military specialists who'd been monitoring supernatural activity and preparing for the day when the hidden world finally emerged into the light. Through the mansion's security systems, they could see the results of Sebastian's intelligence gathering. Dark shapes moving through the forest that surrounded the estate, while thermal imaging revealed the positions of sniper teams and mobile command units that had established a perimeter designed to contain rather than assault, suggesting that capture rather than extermination was the primary objective. The triumvirate's forces had arrived simultaneously, ancient vampires leading contingents of loyal followers who viewed the military presence as both threat and opportunity. Their own siege lines forming a complex 3-way standoff where human soldiers, traditional vampires, and Kieran's loyalists faced each other across a no-man's land that crackled with tension and barely restrained violence. Sebastian himself had vanished from the estate sometime during the night, leaving behind only a letter that Kieran read aloud with a voice that shook with fury and grief, explaining his conviction that the children would trigger a war that would destroy both species and that their deaths were a necessary sacrifice to prevent billions of casualties. The mansion had become the center of a supernatural Cold War, with Mara and her unborn children as the prize that multiple factions would kill to possess or destroy, the weight of their competing agendas pressing against the estate's defenses like a gathering storm that could break loose at any moment with catastrophic results. In the sudden silence that followed Dr. Vasquez's revelations, Mara felt the babies stirring with increasing urgency, their movements conveying emotions she was learning to interpret as clearly as spoken language, fear and determination, and something that felt almost like anticipation, as if they were eager to be born, despite the chaos that awaited them, in a world unprepared for their existence. The choice before her crystallized with terrible clarity: flee the estate and risk losing the children to stress and violence, or remain in what had become ground zero for a conflict that would reshape the supernatural world, regardless of the outcome. Her decision carrying consequences that would echo through history, whether she understood them fully or not. The prophecy demanded willing sacrifice, but it hadn't specified whether that sacrifice was her own life, her children's lives, or the comfortable illusion that humans and vampires could continue to coexist in ignorance of each other's true nature, the weight of choice settling on her shoulders like a crown she'd never asked to wear but couldn't refuse to carry. The siege began at sunset, with the systematic destruction of the estate's outer defenses, human military forces deploying experimental UV floodlights that turned the approaching darkness into blazing artificial daylight, while vampire attackers responded with blood magic that made the very air writhe with crimson energy, shadows taking physical form to tear at anything they touched. The mansion's windows had been reinforced with steel shutters that could withstand small arms fire, but the attackers came prepared with weapons designed specifically for supernatural warfare: pulse rifles that fired concentrated beams of synthetic sunlight, and grenades filled with blessed silver that exploded in clouds of burning metal dust. From her position in the reinforced library, Mara could feel the estate's magical defenses straining under the assault, protective wards that had stood for centuries beginning to crack and fray as opposing forces worked to breach barriers that existed as much in the realm of spirit as in physical reality. The babies inside her responded to the violence with increasing agitation, their movements becoming sharp and urgent, as if they could sense the danger pressing against their sanctuary from multiple directions, each child displaying distinct reactions that revealed personalities already forming despite their early developmental stage. The first child, the one she'd begun thinking of as the healer, pulsed with waves of calm energy that seemed to ease her pain and strengthen her body's ability to cope with stress. Its presence like a warm hand pressed against her heart whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. The second child radiated curiosity and defiance, its movements deliberate and strong, as if it was testing the boundaries of her womb in preparation for breaking free to face whatever threats awaited in the world beyond, its energy feeling like steel wrapped in silk, powerful but controlled. The third child remained the most mysterious, its presence carrying weight that felt ancient and knowing, stirring only when danger was greatest, as if it was conserving energy for moments when its intervention would be most crucial, its movements precise and purposeful, in ways that suggested awareness far beyond what should have been possible for an unborn infant. During the first coordinated assault, when vampire forces breached the eastern wall while human soldiers advanced from the west, Mara discovered that her connection to the children allowed her to access their developing abilities, drawing on powers that flowed through her like electricity through copper wire. When Kieran was cornered by 3 attackers in the main hall, she somehow reached through their bond to share the healing child's energy with him, watching wounds close and strength return, even as the effort left her gasping and weak. Later, when human soldiers used some kind of sonic weapon that disoriented the vampire defenders, she channeled the second child's gift for compulsion, her voice carrying supernatural authority as she commanded the attackers to turn their weapons on each other, the power flowing through her throat like liquid fire that left her voiceless for hours afterward. The third child's abilities proved the most unsettling, visions of possible futures flashing through her mind during moments of greatest danger, showing her which corridors to avoid and which defensive positions would hold against the next wave of attacks. Knowledge that saved lives, but came at the cost of splitting headaches that left her unable to distinguish between present reality and prophetic possibility. Dr. Vasquez worked frantically in the mansion's medical wing, monitoring Mara's vital signs while conducting research that revealed how rapidly her physiology was changing. cellular modifications that were transforming her into something that could survive the demands of carrying vampire offspring while maintaining enough humanity to serve as a bridge between worlds. The readings defied every principle of human biology, showing energy patterns that resembled magical auras more than standard nervous system activity, blood chemistry that included elements not found on the periodic table, and brain scans that revealed new neural pathways forming at impossible speed, connections that might explain her growing ability to channel the children's powers through her own body. Kieran moved through the mansion like a force of nature, coordinating defenses while struggling with the growing realization that protecting Mara might require the one thing he was least prepared to do: letting her go before the siege destroyed everything he'd built over 3 centuries of careful rule. His forces were outnumbered and facing enemies on multiple fronts, the human military bringing technology that neutralized many traditional vampire advantages, while the triumvirate's ancient magic proved equally effective against the estate's modern security systems, creating a three-way battle where victory seemed impossible and survival depended on choosing which defeat would be least catastrophic. Marcus returned during the chaos of the second major assault, his arrival unnoticed until he appeared in the library, carrying a briefcase filled with documents that would destroy any remaining illusions Mara might have harbored about Kieran's true nature, evidence compiled by government agencies that had been monitoring supernatural activity for decades without revealing their knowledge to the general public. The files contained photographs spanning centuries, newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances in cities where Kieran had maintained residences, and testimony from survivors who described a vampire lord whose methods of maintaining order involved public executions and political assassinations that eliminated anyone who threatened his authority. Marcus spread the evidence across the table with the methodical precision of someone presenting a legal case, his voice steady despite the sounds of battle echoing from other parts of the mansion, explaining how intelligence agencies had tracked Kieran's movements through historical records and satellite surveillance, building a profile of someone whose public persona as a reformed ruler concealed centuries of brutality that made modern dictators seem amateur by comparison. The documents included transcripts of intercepted communications, revealing Kieran's involvement in the disappearance of vampire dissidents, financial records showing how he'd accumulated wealth through businesses that exploited human trafficking, and witness statements describing rituals that required human sacrifice to maintain his supernatural powers. A pattern of violence that stretched back to his earliest days as a vampire lord and continued through the present, despite his claims of civilized restraint. Marcus had come prepared with more than just accusations, producing legal documents that offered Mara governmental protection in exchange for her testimony about supernatural activity, immunity from prosecution, and relocation to a secure facility where she could give birth under medical supervision while providing intelligence that would help humanity prepare for the inevitable revelation of the hidden world. The offer forced her to confront the uncomfortable reality that her feelings for Kieran might be the result of supernatural influence rather than genuine emotion. The possibility that vampire abilities included forms of mental manipulation, subtle enough to convince victims they were acting from free will while actually responding to carefully crafted psychological pressure. The confrontation reached its peak when explosions rocked the mansion's foundation, attackers finally breaching the inner defenses, while Mara felt the first sharp pains of premature labor, the babies responding to the crisis by attempting to be born, despite being weeks away from full development, their survival instincts overriding the biological timeline that should have governed their growth. Kieran arrived in the library to find Marcus attempting to physically carry Mara to safety, the human man's protective instincts conflicting with vampire territorial responses in ways that nearly erupted into violence before the medical emergency took precedence over personal animosity. Dr. Vasquez's examination revealed that the triplets were indeed trying to emerge early, their supernatural nature allowing them to accelerate development beyond normal parameters, but not enough to ensure survival if born at their current stage, creating a crisis where any intervention carried the risk of killing either mother or children, or both. The decision Kieran faced crystallized with terrible clarity as alarms blared throughout the mansion, and the sounds of fighting grew closer. Save Mara by allowing the premature birth and accept that the children would probably die, or attempt to sustain the pregnancy through magical intervention that might kill him in the process, but give the triplets a chance to reach viability. Without hesitation, he began the ritual that would channel his own life force into Mara and the children, ancient magic that required the willing sacrifice of years or decades of existence. His appearance already beginning to change as centuries of accumulated power flowed out of him and into the woman whose body fought to sustain 3 lives that represented the future of supernatural society. The ritual to save both Mara and the children required contributions from everyone in Kieran's inner circle, each vampire voluntarily offering portions of their accumulated life force to sustain magic that defied the natural laws governing birth and death, power flowing between them like electricity through a complex circuit where any weak link could cause catastrophic failure. Sebastian arrived at the critical moment, having abandoned his alliance with the vampire hunters, when he realized their true intention was not to prevent supernatural war, but to capture the children for experimentation. His betrayal transformed into desperate redemption as he volunteered his own life energy, despite knowing that his previous actions made him expendable in the eyes of everyone present. The magic that connected them all created a shared consciousness that allowed Mara to experience the memories and motivations of each participant, understanding finally that Kieran's dark past had been shaped by necessity rather than cruelty. His harsh methods employed to protect vampire society from threats that would have destroyed them completely if handled with modern sensibilities about justice and mercy. Through Sebastian's memories, she saw his genuine belief that the children represented an existential threat. His intelligence gathering motivated by fear that their birth would trigger a war that would end with the extinction of both species. His betrayal the result of impossible choices between competing loyalties rather than simple malice or greed. The visions that flowed through their connection showed possible futures where the children succeeded in uniting the supernatural and human worlds, creating a society where both species thrived in open cooperation, but also timelines where their power corrupted them into tyrants who ruled over humans as cattle, or where their existence became the catalyst for a genocidal conflict that reduced both civilizations to scattered survivors hiding in the ruins of once great cities. As the ritual reached its climax, the life force flowing between them like molten gold, the estate's defenses finally collapsed completely, the triumvirate's forces combining with human military units to launch a final coordinated assault that shattered the remaining magical barriers and sent enemies pouring into the mansion from multiple directions. The attackers moved with supernatural speed and coordination, ancient vampires leading squads of soldiers equipped with weapons that fired silver bullets blessed by multiple religions, while electromagnetic pulse devices disabled the modern technology that might have given the defenders some advantage. Kieran's inner circle fought desperately to protect the ritual chamber, their abilities weakened by the energy they'd contributed to sustaining Mara and the children, but they were vastly outnumbered and facing enemies who'd planned this assault for weeks with knowledge provided by Sebastian's earlier intelligence gathering. The mansion's walls began to crumble under sustained bombardment from weapons that combined military engineering with supernatural enhancements. Blessed artillery shells that exploded in bursts of holy fire, while vampire battle mages channeled blood magic into spells that turned the building's own structure against its defenders, stone and steel twisting into forms that reached for their enemies with predatory hunger. As the last of the estate's defenses failed and enemy forces closed in on the ritual chamber, Dr. Vasquez activated emergency protocols that opened hidden passages leading to tunnel systems that had been carved beneath the city centuries ago by previous vampire lords who'd understood the importance of having escape routes that couldn't be monitored or blocked by surface authorities. The retreat became a running battle through underground corridors lit only by emergency lighting, pregnant women and weakened vampires fleeing through passages that echoed with the sounds of pursuit. While the mansion above them burned with fires that would be visible for miles, a beacon announcing to the world that the hidden war between supernatural factions had finally erupted into open conflict. The tunnels beneath Seattle stretched for miles in directions that defied the city's official infrastructure maps, carved from bedrock by vampire lords who'd understood centuries ago that survival required escape routes invisible to human authorities, passages connecting safe houses and blood banks and neutral territories that existed in the spaces between official recognition and complete secrecy. Mara moved through these underground arteries with growing wonder at the complexity of the hidden world that paralleled human society. Emergency lighting revealing chambers filled with medical equipment that could treat supernatural injuries, libraries containing books written in languages that predated recorded history, and meeting rooms where treaties between different species had been negotiated and renewed for longer than most human civilizations had existed. The architecture itself told stories of adaptation and survival. Gothic stonework, giving way to modern concrete and steel in sections that had been expanded or reinforced as the city above grew and changed, creating a subterranean kingdom that remained hidden despite supporting a population that numbered in the thousands. Dr. Vasquez led them through passages she navigated with the confidence of long familiarity, revealing finally that her involvement in Mara's case hadn't been coincidence, but careful planning. Her medical practice serving as a front for an organization that had been monitoring supernatural activity and preparing for the day when the hidden world would inevitably emerge into human awareness. The consortium, as she called it, included scientists and doctors and government officials who'd learned about supernatural existence through various means and chosen cooperation over confrontation, understanding that the integration of two worlds would require careful management rather than the chaos that would result from sudden revelation. Their preparations spanned decades and included medical protocols for treating hybrid pregnancies, legal frameworks for establishing supernatural citizenship, and technological innovations that could bridge the gap between magic and science. All of it building toward this moment when the birth of 3 children would trigger changes that could no longer be contained within the shadows. The tunnels themselves served as a communications network that allowed information to travel faster than any human system could manage, magic flowing through carved channels that connected supernatural communities across continents, carrying news of the triplets' impending birth to beings who'd been waiting generations for this prophecy to fulfill itself. Kieran moved through familiar passages with increasing difficulty, the ritual that had saved Mara and the children leaving him visibly aged and weakened. Silver threading through dark hair, while lines etched themselves around eyes that had remained unchanged for centuries, his supernatural strength diminished to levels that made him vulnerable in ways he'd never experienced since his transformation into a vampire lord. The realization that his reign might be ending settled on him like a weight that grew heavier with each step. Understanding that these children represented not just the future of vampire society, but a transformation so fundamental that traditional leadership structures might become obsolete overnight, leaving him to consider whether his role would be protector or obstacle in the world they would create. Through their bond, Mara felt his struggle with obsolescence and loss, the way 3 centuries of absolute authority were being stripped away by forces beyond his control. But she also sensed something deeper, a relief that came from finally being able to set down burdens he'd never wanted to carry. responsibilities that had isolated him from the simple pleasures of connection and family that the children were already beginning to provide. The safe house they reached after hours of careful navigation proved to be a complex that rivaled the mansion they'd fled, carved from a natural cave system, and expanded into chambers that could house hundreds of refugees, complete with medical facilities that would allow Dr. Vasquez to monitor the final stages of Mara's pregnancy while protecting her from the forces that continued to hunt them through the city above. The supernatural community's response to the approaching birth exceeded even Dr. Vasquez's carefully researched predictions, beings emerging from hiding places that had concealed them for decades or centuries, drawn by instincts older than conscious thought to witness and protect the event that would reshape their world. A pack of werewolves arrived first, led by Elena Blackwood, whose territorial dispute with Kieran 3 decades earlier had nearly erupted into open warfare before being resolved through negotiations that established the current supernatural treaty system, her willingness to set aside old grievances in favor of protecting the children speaking to the magnitude of what was happening. The pack moved with military precision through tunnels that were technically vampire territory, their presence creating tension that crackled through the air like static electricity. But their leader's determination to see the prophecy fulfilled overrode centuries of species rivalry and territorial instinct. Behind them came witches whose covens had foreseen this moment in dreams and divinations, carrying artifacts and spell components that would be needed for the supernatural birth, their magic complementing vampire abilities in ways that created protective barriers stronger than either species could maintain alone. Even some humans had chosen sides in the conflict, government agents and military specialists who'd been briefed on supernatural reality and understood that cooperation offered better outcomes than the inevitable war that would result from attempting to destroy or control beings whose abilities exceeded anything conventional weapons could counter. But the triumvirate had also been gathering allies, vampire houses from around the world responding to calls for assistance that painted Kieran's followers as traitors to their own species, ancient bloodlines that viewed any change to the established order as an existential threat that justified any means necessary to prevent. European vampires arrived with centuries of experience in political manipulation and psychological warfare. Asian courts brought discipline and martial arts techniques adapted for supernatural combat, while African clans contributed knowledge of blood magic that predated vampire civilization itself, their combined forces creating an army that could challenge even the coalition forming around Kieran and Mara. The conflict had evolved beyond simple territorial dispute into a supernatural civil war, fought in the spaces between human awareness, with battles erupting in abandoned buildings and remote forests, while both sides struggled to keep their existence hidden from the authorities that would inevitably become involved if the violence escalated beyond manageable levels. Mara felt the first real contractions while resting in the medical chamber Dr. Vasquez had established. Pain that started in her lower back and wrapped around her abdomen like a band of fire. But each contraction carried with it a pulse of energy that radiated outward through the tunnel system and beyond, calling to supernatural beings across the continent with urgency that overrode every other consideration. The children were beginning their journey into the world, and their approach sent ripples through magical networks that connected every supernatural community, announcing their arrival to beings who'd been waiting lifetimes for this moment while simultaneously alerting enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent the prophecy from reaching fulfillment. Marcus arrived in the tunnels with a team of government specialists, his earlier ultimatum transformed into an offer of protection and cooperation that reflected how quickly the situation had evolved beyond what any single faction could control. His proposal, including safe passage to a secure facility where the birth could happen under controlled conditions, while providing the human authorities with intelligence they would need to manage the integration process that seemed increasingly inevitable. As Mara's labor intensified, supernatural beings from around the world converged on Seattle with urgency that suggested the children's birth represented more than just the fulfillment of vampire prophecy, their arrival creating a gathering that hadn't been seen since the original supernatural treaties were negotiated centuries ago. Dr. Vasquez's monitoring equipment revealed that each contraction generated energy signatures that registered on instruments designed to detect magical activity, waves of power that grew stronger and more frequent as the children prepared for birth, their combined abilities already affecting reality in ways that suggested their emergence would trigger changes that couldn't be contained or controlled by any existing authority structure. The convergence itself created problems that threatened to expose the supernatural world regardless of anyone's intentions to maintain secrecy. Too many powerful beings gathering in one location for human authorities to ignore. Satellite surveillance detecting movement patterns that defied explanation, while seismic equipment registered disturbances that corresponded to magical rather than geological activity. Through her network of contacts, Dr. Vasquez learned that the birth would need to happen at a specific location where ley lines converged beneath the old cathedral downtown, magical energies that would provide the power necessary to safely deliver children whose abilities required supernatural assistance to survive the transition from womb to world. But intelligence gathered by Marcus's team revealed that the triumvirate had anticipated this requirement, positioning their forces around the cathedral in a trap designed to capture the children the moment they were born, understanding that control over the newborns would provide leverage over every supernatural community that had pledged to protect them. The final approach to the cathedral became a desperate race between competing forces, Kieran leading his weakened but determined followers through the city's underground passages, while above them the triumvirate's allies took positions that would allow them to control access to the sacred site. The battle that erupted around the cathedral drew participants from across the supernatural spectrum, ancient vampires wielding powers that could level city blocks clashing with werewolves whose pack tactics had been refined through centuries of conflict, while witches channeled spells that turned the weather itself into a weapon, and government forces attempted to contain violence that threatened to spill over into the human world with catastrophic consequences. Mara felt the children responding to the chaos with increasing urgency, their movements becoming more coordinated, as if they were preparing to defend themselves even before birth. Powers that flowed through her body with intensity that made her previous experiences seem like gentle whispers compared to the symphony of abilities that were awakening within her womb. The pain of labor mixed with visions of possible futures, the third child's precognitive abilities showing her glimpses of what could emerge from this moment of crisis, timelines where the battle ended in triumph or tragedy, where the children grew to fulfill their destiny as bridge builders, or became weapons in a war that would consume both worlds. In the crypts beneath the cathedral, Dr. Vasquez prepared equipment that combined medical science with supernatural knowledge. Monitors and magical circles working together to create an environment where vampire children could be safely born, while protective spells shielded them from the violence erupting overhead. The fate of two species hanging in the balance, as three armies clashed in a battle that would determine whether the future belonged to cooperation or conquest. In the ancient crypts beneath the cathedral, where stone arches carved by medieval monks bore witness to centuries of prayer and secret rituals, Mara brought the children into a world transformed by their very existence, the birth happening as battle raged overhead with sounds of supernatural warfare filtering down through layers of consecrated stone and blessed earth. Dr. Vasquez had created a sanctuary that blended cutting-edge medical technology with protective magic older than written history, monitors tracking vital signs while witches maintained circles of power that would shield the newborns from the violence threatening to consume the city above, the convergence of science and sorcery, creating an environment where impossible births could happen safely, despite the chaos surrounding them. The first child emerged as the cathedral's bells tolled midnight, Elena arriving with silver eyes that seemed to capture and reflect the candlelight, like mirrors forged from starlight, her tiny hands already showing the healing gift that would define her destiny as she unconsciously mended the small tears her birth had caused in her mother's body, power flowing through her touch with the gentle warmth of summer rain on parched earth. Her cry carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the stone itself, calling to every supernatural being within miles and announcing that the prophesied time had finally arrived. The sound carrying magic that began immediately to work changes in those who heard it, dormant abilities awakening in humans whose bloodlines carried traces of supernatural heritage, while established barriers between species began to dissolve like morning fog before the sun. Damien followed 20 minutes later, his birth marked by a sudden silence that fell over the battle raging above, as if the very air had paused to acknowledge his arrival. His mind already reaching outward with telepathic tendrils that connected him to every supernatural consciousness in the city, vampire and werewolf and witch, all suddenly able to hear his wordless communication as he introduced himself to a world he was destined to help unite. His eyes were deep blue like ocean depths, and when he looked at his parents for the first time, both Mara and Kieran felt his presence in their minds, not as invasion, but as completion. The missing piece that had always left them feeling isolated, finally clicking into place with the weight of absolute belonging. Sophia emerged last, her birth coinciding with the moment when the triumvirate's forces finally breached the cathedral's upper defenses, her arrival sending a pulse of precognitive energy through the building that showed every combatant above glimpses of possible futures. Some bright with peace and cooperation, others dark with continued conflict and mutual destruction. The visions causing fighters on all sides to pause in recognition that their actions in the next few moments would determine which timeline would manifest. Her eyes held flecks of gold that seemed to move like liquid metal, and when Dr. Vasquez placed her in Mara's arms, the newborn's gaze focused with impossible clarity on her mother's face, conveying without words that she understood exactly what was happening and what role she would need to play in the transformed world her birth was creating. The moment all three children drew breath together, a wave of energy radiated outward from the cathedral with the force of a controlled explosion, passing through stone and steel and flesh with equal ease, awakening abilities in humans across the globe who'd never suspected they carried supernatural potential, while simultaneously creating new bonds between different species that had viewed each other as enemies for millennia. The triumvirate's power structure collapsed in that instant. Centuries of careful political maneuvering rendered obsolete by the fundamental changes the children's birth had wrought in the nature of supernatural society itself, their authority evaporating like smoke as the rigid hierarchies they'd maintained began transforming into something more fluid and cooperative. In cities around the world, vampires felt their territorial instincts shifting toward protection rather than domination. Werewolves discovered they could communicate telepathically with other species for the first time in recorded history, and witches found their magic enhanced and clarified by energies that made cooperation easier than conflict. The children's influence rippling outward through every supernatural community, like stones thrown into still water. The emergence of the supernatural world into human awareness happened not through violent revelation, but through careful orchestration, guided by Dr. Vasquez and her network of prepared contacts, government officials and medical professionals who'd spent years developing protocols for integration that would minimize panic while maximizing the benefits that cooperation between species could provide. Marcus proved instrumental in establishing legal frameworks that granted supernatural beings citizenship rights while creating oversight mechanisms that would prevent the abuse of abilities that could harm humans. His background in investigative journalism, helping him craft disclosure strategies that revealed supernatural existence through documented evidence rather than sensational headlines that would provoke fear and backlash. The process unfolded over months rather than days, beginning with carefully selected cases where supernatural interventions solved human problems, healers treating conditions that conventional medicine couldn't touch, precognitive warnings preventing disasters, and displays of protective power that cast supernatural beings as allies rather than threats to human welfare. Kieran found himself transformed not just by fatherhood, but by the children's influence on his fundamental nature, centuries of isolating authority, giving way to a form of leadership that emphasized guidance and protection rather than control. His role evolving from vampire king to guardian of a new world where multiple species could coexist without the hidden tensions that had defined supernatural politics for millennia. The children themselves developed with remarkable speed, showing intelligence and awareness that exceeded normal developmental milestones while displaying instinctive understanding of their role as bridges between worlds. Elena gravitating toward any injured creature with healing touches that seemed as natural as breathing. Damien facilitating communication between beings who'd never been able to understand each other before, and Sophia offering glimpses of positive futures that encouraged cooperation while warning away from paths that led to conflict and division. Mara discovered that her own transformation had left her as something unprecedented, neither fully human nor vampire, but a hybrid capable of existing comfortably in both worlds. Her unique physiology, allowing her to serve as a living example of what integration could achieve when fear and prejudice were replaced with understanding and acceptance. She established the first medical practice designed to serve both human and supernatural patients, treating everything from routine supernatural pregnancies to helping newly awakened humans adapt to abilities they'd never suspected they possessed. Her work becoming a model for the kind of cooperation that would define the emerging integrated society. The practice operated from a building that had been carefully chosen for its symbolic value, a converted church where stained glass windows depicted scenes of healing and transformation, the sacred space repurposed to serve a congregation that included beings whose existence had once been relegated to myth and legend, but who now worked alongside human doctors and nurses to advance medical knowledge in directions that neither species could have achieved alone. 5 years after the birth that changed everything, the children attended a school that had been specifically designed to serve students from all supernatural communities as well as humans, the playground echoing with laughter that included voices speaking in languages older than recorded history, while others communicated through telepathic bonds that required no words at all. Elena moved through the playground like a young angel, her healing touch automatically mending scraped knees and hurt feelings with equal skill, her presence creating a zone of calm around her that drew both human and supernatural children who found comfort in her naturally peaceful aura. During recess, she knelt beside a human classmate who'd fallen from the monkey bars, her small hands glowing with silver light as she encouraged the broken bone to remember its proper shape, the healing happening so naturally that the other children accepted it as normal, their generation growing up in a world where such miracles were part of everyday life rather than fearsome displays of otherworldly power. Damien had appointed himself the unofficial mediator for playground disputes, his telepathic abilities allowing him to understand exactly what each party was feeling and thinking, his interventions preventing conflicts before they could escalate into the kind of misunderstandings that had once sparked wars between supernatural communities. His natural diplomacy suggesting that he would follow in his father's footsteps as a leader, but with methods based on empathy rather than authority. When a disagreement erupted between young werewolves and vampires over territory rights to the sandbox, Damien stepped between them with the confidence of someone whose power was communication rather than force, his mental touch showing each group how the others felt while guiding them toward a compromise that satisfied everyone's needs without requiring anyone to surrender their dignity or autonomy. Sophia spent much of her time drawing pictures that depicted futures she could see with increasing clarity as her abilities developed, her artwork covering the walls of her bedroom with images of harmony between species. technological advances that would emerge from supernatural human cooperation, and challenges that lay ahead as word of Earth's transformation reached beings from other worlds who might view the changes as either opportunity or threat. Her latest drawing showed ships descending from space carrying passengers whose intentions remained unclear, suggesting that the integration of supernatural and human societies had been only the first step in a larger transformation that would eventually encompass contact with intelligence that originated beyond Earth entirely, the children's birth having been a catalyst for changes that would continue rippling outward through dimensions and galaxies in ways that none of them could fully comprehend. Mara and Kieran watched their children play from the edge of the playground, their relationship having evolved from desperate alliance into genuine partnership built on shared purpose and deepening love. The crisis that had brought them together transformed into the foundation for a life neither had imagined possible when supernatural and human worlds existed in fearful separation. Their bond had grown stronger through the challenges of raising children whose abilities required constant vigilance and guidance, learning together how to nurture powers that could reshape reality while ensuring that the triplets developed the wisdom and compassion necessary to use those abilities responsibly as they matured into the leaders they were destined to become. The world around them continued to change and adapt, human technology advancing through collaboration with supernatural knowledge, while ancient magical traditions found new relevance in addressing problems that science alone couldn't solve. The integration creating innovations that improved life for everyone, while opening possibilities that neither species could have achieved in isolation, the future stretching ahead bright with promise, despite the challenges that Sophia's drawings suggested were still to come.